What if technology didn't just support the practice of oncology, but made care actually feel more human? Today, we explore that idea with Kathy Oubre. As the CEO of Pontchartrain Cancer Center in Louisiana, Kathy helps shape oncology policy. She's a board member of the Community Oncology Alliance and co-chairs the Drug Policy and Regulatory Affairs Committee. I think that Kathy is one of the most grounded and forward-looking leaders that I've met in oncology. Today, we talk about why her practice embraced ambient technology and how it helped reshape trust between physicians and patients. Then, Kathy shares her look at the broader future of AI in oncology, from identifying biomarkers to expediting prior authorizations. Finally, we explore how to balance innovation with bringing presence and empathy to patient care. If you're an oncology leader, take a listen. You'll get a sharper view of how even smaller community practices can lead the way in a thoughtful innovation. Let's get started. So Kathy, why don't we start by just going into a little bit about yourself and your background and, how did you end up, in oncology and at Pontchartrain?
Sure. So Pontchartrain Cancer Center has been around about 20 years. In fact, next week will be our 20-year anniversary. We are a community oncology practice in Southeast Louisiana. Previously, Pontchartrain was part of a hospital system, and then about 3 months before Hurricane Katrina, they decided to come back out into the community. So Pontchartrain opened 3 days after Hurricane Katrina. We started in Hammond, Louisiana. Then very soon after that, they opened up another practice in Covington, which is about 30 minutes away. And then 2 years ago, we started a third clinic in Bogalusa, which is in more of the rural part of, it's about 30 minutes north of us in Southeast Louisiana. During that time, we have stayed, we're medical oncology only, but we do multi-specialty infusion. So we've been doing that since we opened 20 years ago. It's grown to be, we infuse for a lot of the specialty providers in our area, neurology, dermatology, GI, and orthopedics. And we just, have done that forever. It's been a good outreach program. We started clinical research here about 10 years ago. And a lot of people told us that we'd never be able to make research, take hold and grow in this subset of the world. But, interestingly, we have. And it's been really fun to bring cutting edge therapy to many of the patients in Southeast Louisiana. Currently, we have about 100 patients enrolled in over 21 trials that we have here at Pontchartrain. We also have a physician dispensing pharmacy for all of our patients. And last, we have a hot lab so we can give our patients the opportunity for radiopharmaceuticals if needed for their treatments. And lastly, why leave the hospital? Well, that was something the providers decided to do. And it's really been a lot of fun to do that. I've been with the organization since the beginning, not as CEO. I've basically done everything within the organization except be a nurse, an APP, or a physician. But, the caveat to all of that is these patients are not just patients that walk in our four walls. They're also our neighbors, our friends, people that we see in the grocery store, in Home Depot, and people that are, our own children have gone to school with, a lot of the children of our patients. So it's been a really fulfilling thing to do for the community as well.
One of the things that I think we spent some time on in our previous conversations was just understanding kind of like the perspective between community oncology and academic oncology, and particularly kind of in your, subset of the world. I was wondering if you can kind of share with the audience, like just, what you view the differences are between them and, specifically around like, what are the different challenges that you think the community faces versus the academics?
Well, I think, first of all, the hospitals in our area are primarily 340B entities. So from a business perspective, there is that 340B versus community setting. So it is an they do have different pricing and such, and that's pricing that in a community setting we simply can't have. And due to the growth of 340B in this area over the last many years, we have seen a consolidation or a full movement of community oncology providers go from the community into the hospital setting. So we've seen some access issues, and we've certainly seen more competition over the last few years. And then part of that competition, by extension of 340B growth, is growth of contract pharmacies. And so why is that important? Some of the data and stories in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times over the last several years have talked about migrations of pharmacies from lower socioeconomic zip codes into the wealthier areas of that service area. And that is something that we have also seen in real life here in, the community that we serve. Even in the more impoverished areas a decade ago, they had more physicians and more pharmacies at their disposal. And over that last decade or so, we have seen movement of those providers, of those pharmacies, out of those zip codes into the wealthier areas of our service.
I know that, these challenges are kind of growing. And one of the things that I think we spent a lot of time talking about was really about how, not only policy reform, but also technology is one of the kind of key solutions that you view to solve a lot of these problems. And one of the kind of areas in which we had the pleasure to collaborate on was specifically in implementing ambient technology into the practice. And so I was curious if you can also share, what challenges were you specifically trying to address with ambient? And, what was like the tipping point where, you've heard about the technology, but, what was it that finally made it such that, you took the plunge and said, hey, this is something that we really need to look into and try to adopt?
Well, no one would argue that over the last many years, the EMR, and we're not here to bash EMRs, but they have, they've damaged the physician-patient relationship with the requirements of all the box clicking. But, EMRs are here to stay. And so, how do you reduce that burden and get back to the physician-patient relationship? So our EMR company had been trying to explore ambient AI for several years. They finally landed on a platform, which is DeepScribe, and asked us to be one of their pilot sites. And one of the ways that we've stayed, relevant and innovative in the community setting is we enjoy being a pilot site for a lot of technology and a lot of new ventures. We enjoy being the guinea pig. And it also, from being a community provider, helps set us apart by, as a community oncology practice, being willing to bring cutting edge technologies and platforms into our four walls for our providers and patients. So getting back to ambient AI, Flatiron asked us to be a pilot, and DeepScribe was far enough along in its development that we thought it wouldn't be, too disruptive to the provider-patient relationship in those visits. So we decided to give it a shot. Interestingly, and I know we talked about this, Matt, the clinic visits now are not actually shorter, they're longer. But that's not a bad thing. And why? Because by having the provider not facing the screen and directing his or her attention back to the patient, we've seen increased provider as well as patient satisfaction by just, again, having that ambient AI running in the background. But going back to why our providers went to medical school part of that is to get back to that relationship. And so much of that has been overlooked over the last several years. It's it's like any relationship. You know, we want to be able to see the patients. You know, we want the visual cues of those patients and their family members that come with them. They really do matter within the visit. And immediately, even though the visits were longer, the providers, the patients, and the family members were happier. We saw, satisfaction scores in all those groups go up immediately. And by extension, it also helps deepen that trust factor, between the provider and the patient, which, essentially just by allowing the patient to be more vulnerable with the clinician, facing someone, maintaining good eye contact. It demonstrates all the stuff that we were taught, in school, in kindergarten. It demonstrates presence, interest and respect. And all of those things help build trust. And, just an even deeper rapport, which strengthens connection by conveying, honesty for the most part, and ensuring that, that mutual understanding between the patient and the provider. And, that's what everyone has felt at Pontchartrain as well, patients as well as providers, that ambient tools like DeepScribe have allowed the providers to get back to that deeper interaction with their patients.
It's kind of funny because, a lot of times we get met with a lot of, hesitation from doctors because previously when they have, adopted technology, it has actually, worsened that relationship. I think, it's something you said with maybe the rollout of EHRs or other technologies. But I think this time it's different, right? Like it's actually, funny to think about how technology is transforming in a way where it's actually humanizing care. And, one of the things that I thought that was, really special about what you said was that like, you guys like to be the guinea pig. And frankly, we've been doing this a long time and, we talk to a lot of people and they say they want to innovate. But when I, kind of met you in your practice and talked to, your doctors, you really had this culture of innovation. And I think it's important that like that culture bleeds all the way, from the CEO all the way down to, the front office admin. And, I was wondering like, there was just something really special that I noticed about Pontchartrain that I was wondering if you can kind of share about like, how did you cultivate that culture, at Pontchartrain?
That's a good question. And I don't exactly have the answer for it. It's something that was started at the very beginning. I was reading an article last week from the New York Times that talked about predictors of success and whether it's, your IQ, overall intelligence, where you go to school. And what they came down to was the number one predictor of overall success is grit. And I started laughing about it because really that's one of the hallmarks of Pontchartrain. We're a smaller organization. We compete against 340B entities. So how do we stay relevant? And some of it is just sheer grit. And that kind of grit mentality is something that we actually look for in the hiring process of almost everyone that works for us. And then by extension, fostering the why behind we want to do these things. So, if I make these decisions as CEO, party of one for the organization, they're going to fall flat. The best way to do it is to include everyone. Myself, the providers, the nurses, the front desk, financial assistants, because all of these things that we bring on, ambient AI, chronic care management platforms and such, the only way to make it successful is to bring on every stakeholder within the organization on that journey with you and explain the why to the patients, the why to us, the why to the organization, and how it's going to help all of those stakeholders achieve our goals.
I think that's awesome. And I think like the grit part is really unique because I think, as a startup, as a, founder CEO of a startup, sometimes, those constraints breed creativity
Yeah.
and, you're forced to have that grit because you're forced to innovate and you're forced to be bold and you're forced to go through and make those decisions. And I've also seen it, not just across, smaller organizations that we've deployed to, but even the largest ones, right? The ones that actually have these successful AI implementations are the ones that really view this as kind of a strategic imperative for the organization that goes all the way from the top to the bottom, and they're doing it, all together. And so, yeah, I think what you said is true not only for small organizations, but it's one of those age-old principles that I think work and scale no matter how big you get. The other thing I wanted to ask you about this was, obviously, we have to generate trust with the physicians, but also you have to generate trust with the patients as well, and you have to bring them along to that journey. And I was curious if you could share with our audience, how did you introduce kind of this technology to your patients, and how did you get them to get on board?
So we consent all of our patients around ambient AI, and we weren't quite sure. It's almost like going back to when we brought on clinical trials. We weren't really sure how the patients would respond. Would they be skeptical? Would they embrace it? Would they have a lot of questions? And interestingly, very similar to clinical trials, we really didn't, I don't think anyone to date, no one has not signed the consent. So I thought that was interesting. And very few questions. We developed like, a one-pager around what it was and how we were going to bring this on, your ability to consent, non-consent, some frequently asked questions. We still have a stack of those things. Check in, check out with the medical assistants. I think everyone was really just happy, especially the providers. And I think that bled through in how they were talking to the patients about it as to the upside, as to, what the ambient AI could do during that office visit. But again, we were very clear with everyone and transparent about what we were doing. So again, fostering that relationship that we have with our patients. And it really just kind of went on from there. If we had any serious questions, they were addressed in the visit. And, the providers felt knowledgeable and empowered enough to be able to answer those questions. And I don't think anything came to my office as far as barriers that we needed to address. So it's been pretty seamless.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest surprise that a lot of people have, right? Is, you would think that the patients would be, skeptical of this technology, but really, when this technology helps the provider turn their chair back towards the patient, not look at the computer the entire time, and is able to really give their patient their undivided attention, and they're able to explain that to the patients, genuinely, it's very hard to say no to that, right? And I think, what we'll start to see is this interesting kind of shift where it's not just that the patients, want this, we're starting to see patients expect it, right? They're saying, I expect that level of care when I go see my physician, regardless of what setting you're in. And, I think it's interesting with some of the challenges that you mentioned earlier. Technology really allows us to maintain what it means to care for somebody as these challenges continue to scale. And as, we continue to solve everything else, it allows us to just maintain that eye contact with our patients and not have to really worry about the rest, and just know that the rest is going to get done for them. So Kathy, I'm curious about with ambient, where do you think it goes from here? Right? Beyond documentation, we spent a lot of time kind of dreaming about what else we can do with AI, and specifically with, ambient being able to automate some of the downstream administrative work from the notes. I'm curious, what are you most excited about, or where do you view the best opportunities are?
Sure. So I was thinking a lot about that. I think a lot of us use AI in our daily lives already. And so, what is the art of the possible? And then I always, I'm trained to be a risk person. So I think then about the risk behind it. Now, the basic answer is, the sky's the limit with AI. And, I think most people would agree that we are just, touching the surface of the art of the possible, which is really exciting. But again, I'm a risk girl. So I think about, balancing the excitement with an element of caution, because I am still, I'm in charge of ensuring, safety and patient data, patient safety, HIPAA, all of those things. And so, I also, because again, Matt, I don't look good in orange or stripes. So these are things that just kind of swirl through my brain as I'm thinking about where we go from here. But I was thinking about it. So, there's the clinical applications. So, we can have faster, more accurate diagnoses. Something I talked to you, earlier about was, the biomarker testing, space. It's in its infancy. And, as we have all of these, new drugs coming to market, I mean, the clinical pipeline in oncology is just exploding, which is an amazing place to be in cancer care. But how do we keep up with the pipeline, marry it with the possibilities of AI, and bring that all forward in, with efficiency, accuracy, but minimizing, risk of error, the organization, and ultimately provide more personalized treatment in a faster way to our patients. So, the development of, AI algorithms, analyzing medical images, genomic data, and what's in the EHR already, to maybe identify disease, with greater precision than we're currently doing. That's something I think about. Medical imaging, how is AI already, and then 10, 20 years down the road, going to assist radiologists by flagging anomalies like tumors and CT scans, mammograms, but by extension, therefore increasing detection rates and reducing false positives and treatment earlier. So that, that's something I think about. Pathology, how does AI analyze all these tissue samples and, do you classify cells and identify lesions quicker? And again, to greater accuracy and more efficiently, therefore the potential of maybe starting treatment faster. Then, there's the whole early detection side of things. Now, that's something I think about, patient data, biometrics. That's not something I think about a whole lot, because that's not a lot that, those are things I don't quite understand. But then I really do think about precision medicine. So, analyzing patients' genetic makeups, lifestyle, medical history. And then can we get to a place where we can predict how they would respond to a given treatment, and then make recommendations that the patient may be able to take action on to land on the most effective therapy for, one given patient. That's really interesting to me. Oh my goodness. Is that enough, or do you want me to keep going, Matt?
We can go on, but I think, I totally agree. I think with ambient and with AI, I think the opportunities I see, are in kind of like the three buckets that you kind of described. Like, first is with ambient, I think you have this new data set where you're able to have a new understanding of a patient that, is based off of the words that the patients actually use to describe how they're going through their treatment. But then it's all about the synthesis of that data and analyzing that data and using AI to scale the current processes or discover new processes to bring all the information together to really make sense of it. And then third, I think is one that I think people often overmiss is like, how do you actually integrate that seamlessly into the clinical workflow, right? So not just being able to analyze and create a report that's going to be shoved in, a document folder, in the EHR and, never looked at. But how do you actually inject that into the clinical workflow at the right time and for the right patient that's fully contextualized? And so those three buckets are, I think, where, as you described, are like these really interesting opportunities for AI that I think are going to impact care, in all their own ways. And it really requires everything to kind of come together for it to actually work.
Well, there are two, things though that do concern me moving forward, and they're already here. But one of the things that concerns me is remote patient monitoring, so wearable devices. And I just have to call it out because there are a couple of things I think about from the practice side. Now, it's really interesting, to be able to track patients' vital signs, activity level, and there, by extension, alerting that healthcare provider, to potential health issues in real time. But then the caveat I think about is, since we're talking about real-time alerts, is the liability and the work then placed on that physician to address that potential healthcare issue in real time. So that's something I think about. If it's a 2 a.m. or a 4 a.m. event. And so I think about that, the window and the risk of having to, the provider needing to address that. And then I think about, the financial liability of these wearables, if they get damaged or if they get lost. And then I really do think about the level of interest that the insurance company might start having in this type of information. Will they tie it to individual patient premiums? And those are things that make me concerned. And one of the reasons is that these devices are not perfect. And it's anecdotal. However, I have a Sleep Number bed now, and it's really great. I mean, I can adjust the head and the foot and the settings, and it's fabulous. And it gives me a score every morning. But it's not a perfect score because, the dog jumped in bed at 3 o'clock and it gives me a bad score and says I'm restless. I was sleeping like a champ, but the dog jumped on the bed and it messed with my score. And so it's all of those things that I think about with technology and kind of where we're going. And again, the art of the possible. And then something else I was thinking about, if I may, is there are some new technologies coming out that I've been approached that are these virtual health assistants. So, AI chatbots that might help with patient inquiries, scheduling, or even, medication reminders or basic responses to some patient questions. And that one, I don't think Pontchartrain will ever likely adopt, because it kind of goes against our philosophy of a patient-physician relationship. And the way I kind of think about it is, even now, if I call my credit card company, I'm the one who's sitting there hitting 0 because I want to talk to a real person. Mm-hmm. I don't really want to go through, the menu of offerings. I just want to be able to talk to a person. And we tried, kind of that, decision tree matrix when patients called several years ago, and it went over like a lead balloon because the patient just wanted someone to answer when they called. Even if we had to transfer them, they wanted someone to answer immediately, And again, that fosters that relationship, being able to address the patients by name. And, they know the nurses by name. And so those are things I think about in what we can do and what Pontchartrain really is, willing to do in continuing to provide healthcare.
That's really interesting, Kathy. I think on the voice agent side of things, I'm curious, I think the relationship with the patient is so important, but you also have kind of another problem around being able to scale that level of care. And,
Mhm.
in healthcare, we have such a shortage of providers, or, even if it's not providers, even just the office administrators, they're also faced with, a lot of turnover. It's hard to hire good people. It's hard to keep good people. And, I think where AI is going is it's almost going to be indistinguishable from like your best office administrator. You're the best person you've ever hired. You can kind of create like an AI avatar that talks exactly like him or her, is able to answer questions exactly like him or her. And, I'm curious, like, where do you think the technology really needs to mature to for you to view that as like a viable option? Or is it just saying, hey, like, we always need to have kind of this human like oversight with any of these like communications with the patients? And, I'm just curious to get your take on that. Like,
It's a great question.
yeah.
So the way I think about it is, Matt, we're not trying to replace me. Like that's not the goal of AI here.
Uh-huh.
But anything that helps foster, deepen, nurture the provider patient relationship. And by extension, I said, it's provider. So that's nurses, APPs, physicians, anyone that's involved in that patient care. And by the way, the nurses didn't like when we tried doing any type of those triage things either. They wanted to be able to talk to their patients, and so that was always very interesting to us. But so again, if the technology fosters that relationship, we're interested. If it replaces someone, because we're actually again, I'm speaking just for Pontchartrain, but we're scaled pretty well. Now, we had a 60% turnover during COVID. It was awful. And we went through a period of time for about 2 years after, where lots of turnover and it was really difficult. But, knock on wood, we're in a very good spot right now. And I hope that will maintain for a period of time. So I'm hopeful, but I'm an employer. I'm not in favor of bringing on technology to replace someone that I employ. And so those are the things I kind of think about. Again, if it helps foster that relationship, deepen it, grow it, I'm interested. If it's going to replace, then I'll listen, but I'm a little more skeptical just top line.
Yeah. I think that's the right way to think about it, right? Like I think, with AI, I think the nearest term opportunities is really how do you, automate work that people don't want to do today. And that work is distracting them from higher value work that they can be doing that pound for pound would deepen that patient's, relationship more or provide, better treatment and a better experience for that patient. And so I think in healthcare, a lot of those opportunities, like those are the near-term opportunities that we can really tackle. Because in healthcare, there's just so much of that. And we have our plate full with just automating a lot of those things. But I think ultimately, it's like, there are things that we would love to just spend all of our time on, and those we should hold sacred. And, as we're able to increase the number of patients that we see, while also deepening the experience and the relationship with each of those patients that we see, more work is going to be created. And like, we really need, that like AI to do that stuff, is what I'm hearing you're saying. Yeah.
Prior authorizations. That's something that comes to mind when we talk about administrative tasks. I'm certainly in favor of things that help with the prior authorization task, which is, I don't want to replace people with it, but it is one of the most burdensome, maddening processes that we do at Pontchartrain. And it continues to grow. The insurers continue to put more and more prior authorizations in place. So it is something that we've had to devote more manpower to. I'm interested in lessening the burden for those people, not replacing the people, but in helping, because it's a hair pulling process. So that is something that is interesting to me. So we'll see. It's a stay tuned.
Yeah. And I think ambient is interesting because I think a lot of the the triggers that kick off those downstream processes, they are, they happen at the point of care. And usually when they, after the point of care, they put in the order, they finalize their note. That's when it gets, flagged as like, oh, like this might need a prior auth, or we might need to do this other process for this. And, I think what's really awesome is that with ambient, and with this prior authorization integration, you're able to kind of shift the thinking of those back office or those downstream activities happening after the fact. To start thinking about those things being kind of kicked off live while we hear that, these things are happening. And as a result, the patient really gets better care, right? There's just so many times I've heard about, either, the physician orders something and then they didn't realize that they needed a prior authorization. You have 10 business days later, it gets denied, and then the patient, has trouble accessing their medication, and it's just a whole mess, right? And it's like those are the types of problems that I think that we live in a world that those problems can be solved today. And if we can try to figure out a way to integrate AI and get people to adopt it and foster a culture like you have at Pontchartrain, that's where you can really start to see this innovation impact patient lives.
Sure. So if we can get, insurance companies and physician offices kind of on board collectively, prior authorizations, financial assistance with manufacturers or foundations, all of those things that are just very disjointed right now, to be able to smooth, the patient journey in order to have access to care in a much quicker way. Everyone's interested in that. We would be all ears.
Kathy, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. Like in those instances where there is like benefit across the value chain, right? To the patient, to the provider organization, to the insurer, to the pharmaceutical company, who do you think pays for it?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? That's a very good question. And it's complicated. Oh, Matt, that wasn't on our list of questions. It's a good one, though. But we won't be able to share that cost with the insurer, because I'm thinking about it. Every insurer, even currently, has different workflows for prior authorization and such. So how do you get even a large percentage of those stakeholders to agree on one platform? And then do you share cost? It might, in my opinion, rest with the insurer. And, maybe you get a little bit of a gold card status if the physician practice also adopts it. Whereas if you still have to do things in a more manual fashion, current state, then you just have that process you go through. We could do it that way. But then by extension, I'm curious as to what then would the insurance company want to do with some of that data that, if it's done by AI, is easier for them to ingest and take a look at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in oncology especially, there is this unique opportunity. And I think I've seen, a lot of companies have been built this way where, the downstream benefits are able to pay for the solution on the behalf of the patient or on the behalf of the provider organization. And I think, AI, we're going through a very interesting time because, I think traditionally people have thought of AI as, a SaaS business, and they typically charge a seat-based subscription where, for however many licenses you get, you're paying per month or per year for that license. And there's starting to be a lot more focus on how do you have more creative solutions to pricing AI that is really kind of sharing in the risk of the value that's created. And I think when you start going to a lot of these, other downstream processes that do have, they do touch multiple stakeholders in kind of the value chain, it's important to, I think, just think about, like, do you just go in and charge, the average SaaS kind of subscription here? Or is there a more creative solution to really alleviate kind of the burden of paying for these innovations for the provider organization and for the patient by just exploring some other more creative business models?
I think we have to get in a room. I think insurance, patients, providers, margins continue to slim for physician practices. So I think that would be a concern. And then if you talk to patients, they already think healthcare is more expensive and too expensive. So I don't think it would be reasonable for any of those other entities to try to put that financial burden on the patient. The patient should never be part of that financial equation. So therefore, by extension, I would think the insurer, and as a result, would probably be the holder of that data. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
I'll get someone from insurance as their next guest, and I'll ask them this question for you, Kathy, and I'll get back to you.
Oh, and let me know.
So Kathy, we're almost out of time here, but I wanted to just ask you kind of two closing questions that I usually ask everybody that comes on the podcast. The first one is like, what is something that you wish more people understood about oncology, especially talking to someone like me who is a technologist or is a startup founder? What do you wish they would just know or appreciate or have in the back of their mind before approaching you?
That it's not a sad place to work in. I'm serious. And it's maybe again goes back to the culture of our organization. But when you see people in the community, they always go, "Oh, that must be such a sad place to work." And the thing is, it's not. I think it's one of the best things I've ever done. Yes, we do lose some patients, and that is true. But we have a privilege. We get to be with these patients and their families at some of the worst time of their lives. And they allow us to go with them on that journey. And, even if the outcome isn't, curable, so, just, what we all learn and experience along the way, has significant impact on you. And that can't be lost on any of us. And it's not. And so whenever I tell, people that when I'm interviewing them and such, or when I meet them in the community, I don't always want to get into it, but I don't feel that Pontchartrain and most oncology practices are sad places. I think they are grounded and hopeful and dedicated to their missions of providing care to their patients.
And I can really feel that, especially in the community. I do think that everyone that I've met, especially in on the community oncology side, or just in oncology in general, the view that what we're doing is, we're helping the patient. And, with me and my mom through her treatment, that's